Hello and welcome to another episode of the Other Ranting Atheist. Yes, I'm not the only one out there, and I'm really happy about that. So, what will I be ranting about today? Well, I'm on my way to work right now, and I was just thinking about. I was just getting ready for work. I was thinking about Romans 9 and how it kind of contradicts Second Peter 3:9, which led me to think of a thing that's common among street preachers when they try to justify the fact that God, um, sends people to hell. And one thing that they will say is that, God is merciful, but he is also just, as if to say that his justice overrides his mercy, which would be a contradiction of sorts because to say that God's merciful but also just, what you're literally saying is that God is contradiction because mercy and justice are opposites. When you have mercy on someone, you're not having justice, and when you're giving out justice, you are abandoning mercy. The both cannot be true at the same time. And so, and this goes back to something that I've said repeatedly, that the whole idea of Christianity is full with ambiguous, contradictory statements because Christians, and of course including street preachers, which is who I tend to speak about the most, like to play the fence. They like to have it both ways. In other words, they like to cover all the bases. So, in instances where God seems to be merciful, they'll say God is good mercy. But what about the instances where God doesn't seem to be merciful? Well, that's where the saying comes that God is merciful, but he is also just. So, they're basically playing the fence in the situations where God is merciful. They say God's merciful, but in situations where God doesn't seem to be merciful, then that's where the whole argument of God is also just comes in. And that's basically because they want to have it both ways. Acknowledging that the Bible is contradictory, um, that its nature is contradictory, and so that's why they have to come up with ambiguous statements that allow them to cover all the bases. Like I've said before, like the Trinity, God being three and one at the same time, covers both bases, where God seems to be one God, and also where God seems to be more than one God. That's why the concept of the Trinity exists. Same thing with the concept of Jesus and him being 100% man and 100% God. That covers him being 100% man, covers the basis where God seems to not be uh, uh, God, where Jesus seems to not be supernatural. For instance, when he gets tempted in the wilderness, then they can claim that Jesus is 100% man. But then when Jesus performs miracles, they can claim that he's 100% God. It allows them, like I said, to play both sides of the fence. And that's the whole point of that concept. God being merciful but also just allows them to play both sides, where God seems to be merciful but then God doesn't seem to be merciful. Then they use that as an excuse. And I was thinking about that and how basically this is Christians admitting that the Bible is contradictory without admitting that the Bible is contradictory. So they believe, because the Bible is contradictory in nature, and um, it does talk about concepts that are contradictory. And so because Christians claim to believe the entirety of the Bible, that means that they have to believe contradictory um, ideas, and that's where these ambiguous Christian concepts comes in, that allows Christians to believe two opposing things at the same time, like the examples that I've already mentioned. And so I was just thinking about that because Romans 9 came to mind, which clearly talked about predestination, which is a concept that most Christians don't accept. If And that's why many denominations of Christianity reject all views that are reformed in nature. You know, whether you're talking to Reformed Baptists or you're talking to Calvinists, they are rejected by most denominations of Christianity mainly because of the concept of predestination. The reason why Christians reject predestination is because they know in their hearts that predestination is by nature unjust. And a big part of why it's unjust is because Christians can't seem to fathom the idea that a just God would send babies to hell, or the fact that a just God would create people for the purposes of going to hell. They can't wrap their mind around how God can be just and allow something like that to happen. And so they reject predestination only because there's no workaround. There's no way to believe that God is just and that predestination exists. So that's a concept that Christians can't seem to um, that's a contradictory concept of God being just and merciful that Christians can't seem to wrap their heads around it. So that's why they reject predestination. And that's why they've come up with the concept of age of accountability, which again is not biblical. Because in their minds they can't seem to wrap their mind around God being just but then predestining people for hell. And that's because it is contradictory, like many other concepts that they do believe in. So why is it that that is a concept that they specifically can't wrap their mind around? I think it's because it involves, well, it kind of abandons the whole idea of free will, which is an excuse that Christians use to absolve God of responsibility despite the fact that He is the creator of everything. Which again is another contradictory concept, because to say that God created everything, but yet He's responsible for some things and not others is contradictory. Because if He created everything, especially if He's omniscient and He knows everything, then there is no way God is absolved of any responsibility. If He created everything, then He's responsible for everything He created. But in order to say that God created everything, but absolve Him of responsibility concerning things that Christians don't like, that's where they came up with the concept of age of accountability. So, when it comes to babies, as humans, we tend to think as babies as innocent, and that's because they are. Babies don't do anything intentionally. They can't. They don't have the capacity, and we know this, which is why we can't comprehend the concept of God sending babies to hell and Him being just, despite the fact that God is not just because He does just things. If you read the Bible, God is just barely because He says that He is. And so Christians also do this thing where they say that the reason why God has to punish sin, and the reason why hell exists, and the reason why God has to be just, or has to punish certain actions, is because that's in His nature. Being just, God has to punish evil, they will say, even though there are plenty of examples of God not punishing evil. So God has to punish evil, otherwise He wouldn't be just, which is a judgment on their part. Something that Christians are not supposed to be allowed to do, because as an atheist, and I've had conversations with Christians already, when I judge God's actions, Christians default to how dare you judge God? Who are you to judge God? When Christians judge God all the time by saying what He has to do and what He doesn't have to do in order to be just. For instance, God has to punish evil to be just. No, He doesn't. Because if you are acknowledging that God can do whatever He wants, then you can't also acknowledge that in order to be just, God has to do this and God has to do that. Because then what you're acknowledging is that God can't do whatever He wants. Because if justice is aligned with God's nature, that means that God has to be just. And if certain actions align with God being just, that means that God has to do those acts. I'm sorry, God has to do those actions. So what you're doing is you're pinning God in a corner and saying that he can't do whatever he wants. In order to be just, which aligns with his nature, he has to punish evil. But then that's akin to saying that God can't do whatever he wants. And so I just wanted to do this short video talking about how Christians, which I've said before, how Christians like to play the fence, but I wanted to use this specific example of God being merciful and also being just, which is a saying that Christians do really to put their mind at ease with the idea of a God um, doing things that they would consider to be immoral, like sending people to hell or creating people for the purposes of hell. According to Romans 9, um, vessels, creating vessels of dishonor prepared for destruction. These are things that Christians know in their hearts to be unjust, and so they have to come up with theology in order to counteract these ideas that they know doesn't sit well with them. So yeah, I just wanted to do a quick video. This video went a little longer than I wanted to, but I'm on my way to work and I had this thought in my head that I had to kind of let out. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and I'll see you in the next.